Hello, my name's Alastair McLellan. I'm the editor of HSJ. Welcome to the HSJ webinar on industry and NHS collaboration during the pandemic period. There have been many astonishing things that have happened during this testing and trying period for the country and for the NHS. One of the most striking has been the way in which the pharmaceutical and medical devices industries have worked together with the NHS to address a series of challenges. A whole set of bureaucratic and cultural barriers have been removed to really increase the speed of collaboration between the service and the two industries. We wanted to explore this in more depth, so we've convened this webinar. Joining me today, I have Chris Hopson, Chief Executive of NHS Providers, who has been much about during these past few months, representing the views of the service. We have Hugo Breda, who is the UK Managing Director of Johnson & Johnson's Medical Devices, and Dr. Rav Seeruthun, who is the UK Medical Director of Roche. So what I'm going to do is to ask all three of our participants to give a very short 2-3 minute overview of what they've seen and experienced about how things have changed over the last 3 months or so. And I may ask some questions after that, and then we're going to get into a discussion. So, Rav, you're going to kick us off. Please take us away.
Great. Thanks, Alastair. Okay, so this unprecedented pandemic led to a truly collaborative effort to beat COVID-19 that was delivered in partnership to meet the NHS needs and those of its patients. This effort began for us in March 2020, when at Roche we saw the emergence of signals from Wuhan relating to the use of one of our medicines, tocilizumab, in COVID-19 patients. There were 3 key learns from this collaborative effort for us across the time period. The first area was partnering with a focus on patient outcomes, Alastair. So why did that happen? I think it happened because we had a shared common goal that we all agreed on. Our first shared common goal was that the use of unproven medicines off-label was not in the interests of patients. That was outlined in a joint chief medical officer letter that was issued to all trusts in April, and we supported that. Next was the speed of essence as the pandemic progressed at pace across the United Kingdom. I've never seen a closer collaboration in my 30-odd years of working in the NHS or in the private sector. And this was specifically at a trust level, at an academic level, such as the recovery trial, which was carried out at Oxford University, in collaboration with the pharmaceutical industry. The second area is how we collaborated further to limit the indirect consequences of COVID-19, probably an area that Chris will be closer to. An area of risk here is how do we ensure clinical trials in the UK are not left behind those of other countries. Now, obviously, that's a large part of Roche's portfolio of medicines are in oncology, so cancer treatment. And we've seen a trend already that there were a delayed number of cancer trials that were started either before the pandemic, or they're either on hold or they're delayed, and new trials are not starting. This trend is different in the UK than in other countries. Just one stat for you, for example, 16.8% of UK sites aren't allowing any visits, and that's 7% globally. So how can we partner here with the clinical research networks, with academia, the NHS trusts, to ensure these necessary resources are put in place? And thirdly and finally, how do we get confidence back for patients to engage in the NHS and in hospitals? Here, I think there are clear areas that the pharmaceutical industry can partner with the NHS on. Can we see, for instance, treatments that were traditionally delivered in hospitals and in a hospital setting delivered closer to a patient's home, in fact, in-home, given home care? Now, a very close subject to my heart is the issue, obviously, of diversity and inclusion, and that's been at the forefront of our minds, obviously, over the last month. Now, I worry that there may be a specific issue with confidence in the service, which we saw emerge with the pandemic, with the disproportionate impact of BAME, people affected by COVID-19. Now, I see that in my industry too, because that group is underrepresented in clinical trials. So ultimately, really, how do we collaborate further to meet the needs of the NHS and its patients and embed these learnings, Alastair, from the pandemic would be an area that I know that we're all focusing on at the moment.
Thank you, Rav. Can I just ask you to comment briefly on the cultural changes you have seen in the way in which the service and the industry sector have been collaborating? Because that has been one of the most striking things, I think, during this period. And I know you've been involved in various discussions, some of which may be private, of course. But I just wonder if you could give a sense of how much more efficiently you think the two sectors have worked together, and whether or not, how much of this is just a product sheerly of the emergency that we faced at the particular time, and how much might be preserved. Just give us your sense of what's happened and what's felt different about the last 3 months.
Alastair, no, I completely agree that, I mean, the word unprecedented has been used probably far too many times in this pandemic. The biggest learn for us was everyone, because of the pandemic setting, was willing to collaborate in a speedy time period. So things that were to take 3 to 6 months were happening in 3.5 days. I'll give you a good example. We were running a number of trials, very well known as the recovery trial, which read out a result last week in COVID-19 with a positive result for an older drug, dexamethasone. To get that trial approved and to be part of it would have taken, for instance, 3 to 6 months. The MHRA were aligned, the trusts were aligned, and the ethics committees were aligned. And those time periods were down to days. I mean, literally 3 to 4 days. So I think it was both a collaboration that was driven by the pandemic and the speed that was needed, but the fact that everyone was available. And then another trend you were seeing is, as we're doing today, everyone was available digitally. So it wasn't go down to London, it wasn't all wait for people's diaries to open up. It literally was jump on these calls, let's get everyone together in the same setting, in the same place, in a Zoom or a Hangout, and let's get things done. So I think those two learnings are something that I think we can embed going further forward.
Thank you very much, Rav. Hugo, over to you.
Hi, Alastair. Well, just building further upon what Rav was saying, also in the medical devices industry, we saw unprecedented level of collaboration with the NHS at the outbreak of COVID-19. And maybe I pick out just one domain, and that of providing digital assets to the NHS. I think often digital was the only way to reach out, diagnose, engage, even treat patients. I think we saw an acceleration in the way and openness from NHS to embrace these digital technologies. And maybe I pick out one example, the setup of trauma centers, which is something that needed to happen in a very short time frame. So it was about weeks or often even days for the setup of these centers. We as industry, we have delivered a lot of digital assets, technologies, and to name out one, SPI, a J&J technology, which is a kind of GPS for ORs, but can also used outside OR, is a system, a digital asset that guides medical staffs through new protocols or old protocols. But in this case, you often have people that have to work together in a different physical location on different kind of protocols. So helping that run smoothly with a fast learning curve, I think industry delivering digital technologies to the NHS was a great example on how together we tackled emergency situations, like the example of setting up a trauma center in just a couple of days.
Thanks, Hugo. I'm very interested about these trauma centres, because I must admit, until we began preparing for this webinar, I wasn't aware of the role that the medical devices sector had played in setting up the trauma centres. Again, a bit like the question I asked Rav, because I think one of the things we really want to unwrap in this webinar is what can we keep from this period? What ways of working, which have allowed us to do things so much more quickly, can we preserve? So what were some good examples of the contribution you made to setting up these trauma centres that simply wouldn't have happened in the way that they happened before the pandemic struck?
Well, you saw that because of the emergency situation, people go much faster to the heart of the matter. We need to set up a trauma center. It's a nightmare, of course, just from a logistic point of view. I don't know if you can imagine what comes to such a thing as setting up a trauma center. Just all the products, the logistics, the patient flow, that must be different people that have to work together, and that, of course, producing safe surgery with good outcomes. Typically that takes sometimes years of meetings to do any changes, and now the openness to implement something new, innovative, was just there. There seemed to be also more confidence in each other, maybe also from our point as industry. But I think that's the way forward, and with having now digital in that environment, you also have big data, because you track, you trace, you measure, so you can learn fast. So you can also quickly see, for this situation, for instance, what is working, what is not working, what can we do better, how can we accelerate, how can we improve, how can we make things efficient. And for me, that's, if I link that to existing initiatives, so take for instance the whole GERF, getting it right first time, which is about data and efficiency and improving. Well, I think that this is the way forward for the NHS and for industry, like to work together based upon data points to treat more patients in a more safe and efficient way.
Thank you very much, Hugo. Chris, your view, please.
Well, I think, Alastair, we'd all agree that the NHS did something quite extraordinary in the first peak in terms of, I mean, we've described it in a number of different ways. One of my favourite phrases is we completely shifted shape. We almost kind of turned the whole service on its head and created 33,000 beds to treat coronavirus patients. And we moved at a speed which was just, something we've never, ever done before. And what's really striking for me is that when I talk to the chief executives and the leadership teams of the trust that we represent, you just kind of got that sense of sort of three or four things. First of all, real focus on a single objective and being empowered to just get on with it and make it happen. Secondly, and I think both Rav and Hugo have put this up really well, is the need to move at speed. But again, what really struck me as people kind of encountered problem after problem, it was very clear to us that the reason they overcame those problems is because of the quality of the partnerships they built. And in a sense, it gives me an opportunity to say, a very big thank you to all the commercial partners without whom we wouldn't have been able to achieve what was achieved. And a huge range of people. Oxygen system suppliers was a very good example for us, where effectively people were having to really do some pretty extraordinary things to ensure oxygen supply was available at real pace, right the way through to pharmaceuticals, medical devices. It was right the way across the board. And what you just kind of got the sense of was people having to really solve things very fast, but realizing they could only do that if they did that in partnership with the commercial sector. And I think it worked incredibly well.
Chris, for the 18 odd years that I've done this job, whenever I've chaired similar meetings, the issue that comes up time and time again is that of a question of trust between the NHS and the pharmaceutical sector, and the sometimes uneasy relationship between the two. I think on a sort of, if you like, a technical level or a scientific level, there has always been an awareness that both parties need each other, but there has long been concern on behalf of the industry that it is not trusted by the NHS for a whole range of reasons, and within the NHS, a concern that that if they work too closely with industry, they'll be getting themselves into something that perhaps they shouldn't, or they couldn't get themselves out of, or that they might end up being told off by a regulator or a politician. Has what we have seen, so one of the questions we're all asking ourselves is how much of this change, shift to digital service delivery, for example, how much of this will continue after the pandemic period? On that issue of culture, which seems to me, all of the technical issues aside, the one persistent issue for the last how many odd decades, I'm wondering whether you think that there has been a shift in people's attitudes during this period on behalf of the NHS. And I'll ask Hugo and Rav if they think that is the same with the industry side, or is it just a moment in time that is going to blow away?
Well, I think it's very difficult to tell at this point, but I mean, the observation I would make is, as you were asking the first bit of your question, the phrase that popped into my mind was "need must." I think, people chief executives kept describing themselves to me as serial problem solvers. They basically had to solve really big, complex problems at speed, and they knew very quickly that they couldn't solve them unless they brought in appropriate external expertise. So all of the things that you describe, which I recognize about building trust over time and being very careful about some of the regulatory stuff, etc. Needs must meant that you had to move at real pace, and you had to make it work, because if you didn't, then effectively you wouldn't be able to, provide the service that you wanted to. I think the culture and the psychological thing, I think, is a really interesting thing. For me, I do think one of the things I I definitely pick up is, and this is kind of a fairly well-known phenomenon, that if you work closely with somebody during a period of extreme stress, you tend to build a quality of relationship that then sticks for a long time. And again, this might sound a bit weird, but I'm very struck by when you talk to people in the military who've gone through things like Afghanistan, about the bonds that get built between soldiers serving together, that they last a lifetime. And I suppose my observation would be, if you're looking on the positive side, it was very clear to me that some really deep relationships were built at real pace, because our chief execs were incredibly grateful for the way in which their commercial suppliers were prepared to mobilize at extreme speed, and in a sense kind of work with the same intensity and at the same pace. And my hope would be that some of those relationships forged, if you don't mind me calling this, in the kind of the heat of battle, I think there's quite a good chance they'll last longer. And just one final observation is, again, one of the phrases of the moment is, we're never going back. We're not going back to where we were before. And for example, the stuff about, the way in which we've taken outpatient appointments and consultations online, I cannot believe we'll go back. My kind of sense is people recognize that's a change that, absolutely they shouldn't let go. So my hope is, in quite a lot of these areas, people won't let go of it, and they'll fight very hard to keep them.
So, Hugo, let me come to you and ask you that similar question. Do you think, pardon me, that there has been a sea change in that culture of trust? Has the suspicion from the NHS sector gone? And I suppose both for Hugo and Rav to reflect off, I'm interested in what you detect the view of the NHS, but also the view of the various regulators, whether they too are forging bonds with them during this period that perhaps will mean we could, for example, see the faster introduction of innovative medicines and technologies in the future. Hugo, what's your take on it?
So yes, like Chris said, I also saw from our side that that increased trust level. Of course, this was in a moment of high need. So for me, I really hope that we keep much of that atmosphere, and that with that we make now the real step to like a value-based relationship. And too often we were seen or we were forced in a relationship of suppliers and buyers of simply products. I think we are proving here as an industry that we can bring value, and that it's better for also the NHS to work together on outcomes, on projects, on value, on entire patient pathways. Then we as an industry can deliver so much more to the NHS and be of such much more value. You saw that also in the whole topic of products that are only available and manufactured outside Europe. You want to buy it, you run into trouble. If you intensely work together with trusted partners, you can achieve so much more. And yes, we saw this from our part now during the emergency situation. But if I look ahead, the challenges are there to stay, because the waiting lists were already an all-time high before the outbreak. We're trending now to, 10 million patients on the waiting list for end of the year. So it will be even more important to be more trusted partners and to work together on specific projects like tackling waiting lists.
Okay, Hugo, let me press you a little bit on the regulatory side and whether or not, because obviously many of the things that you have needed to do, you and Rav and other people that have needed regulatory people to say, yeah, that's okay, get on with it. And normally that can take a long time, and there are good reasons why it has typically taken a long time. I'm just interested in how much this period has actually shown that these things don't need to take that amount of time, and that penny may have dropped with regulators. So Hugo, give me your view on that, and then Rav, I'll come to you.
Yeah, I think on the pharmaceutical side, I'll let Rav comment on that. For us, maybe I go back to the digital aspect. And so typically for digital innovation, there are all kinds of reasons not to do it or slow it down, and every trust has then on top of that its own regulations, and it's often a nightmare for us to bring any digital innovation. So many regulations, so many people to talk to, and at the end it takes ages to bring any innovation effectively in the market. And now we saw that suddenly, it was just in a couple of days, you could solve this kind of problems or barriers and have something effectively installed, implemented in a specific hospital or trust, and simply working and providing immediate value.
Thank you. Rav, give us your experience about how much the culture has changed.
Alastair, I'm just going to build on something Chris said. I spent a bit of my life as an A&E registrar, and what I learned there as a reg was you've got to be transparent, and you've got to share all the information you have at the same time, because you don't know what's happening in one bay versus another bay, because you're moving constantly between them. So what we learned in very real time was that the relationships had to change, to your point, Alastair. So we saw a signal coming out of Wuhan. I mentioned that earlier. That was on March 5th. And the first thing we knew was we didn't know if any of these drugs were going to work or not. And in fact, unfortunately, we're still in that situation. So the first thing we did, which was not normal practice, we called the MHRA. And that's not normal. You usually go through a process, use lots of forms, and we just thought, no, look, we're going to be 100% transparent here. Because this epidemic was obviously, unfortunately, moving across from China to Italy and then Spain, we could see what was happening in other countries. So that's a bit unprecedented. And what the MHRA did was then bring other people to that conversation, because we have that shared common goal, which was how do we look at that? I'll give you two other time points from there, which are astounding. So that was March 5th when we first saw the signals. By April 11th, we'd partnered with the Imperial College and the Trust, and we'd started a study there which would explore this in the intensive care setting, the setting that we thought the drugs would be most appropriate, not just our drug, but many drugs, which I think was another piece. It was collaboration between companies as well. And then, as you know, the trial that's got a lot of news, Recovery, coming out of Oxford with Martin Landry and Peter Horby, that was the following week where we entered that trial. So I think for me, the lessons were actually born out of the work I'd learned in the NHS, which is share, be transparent. And to be honest, we were all in the same situation. What I learned was there would be certain people in this time who were catalysts, who were helping this accelerate. And I'll name one. His name's Jonathan Sheffield. He's the CEO of NIHR. And what he did was look at all the different stakeholders and try and align them together. Because ultimately, for us, we had to make sure that we didn't have huge amounts of off-label use, because we'd have nothing to learn for. And we've all mentioned we're all worried about a second peak or the second wave. How do we make sure that the lessons learned now are embedded? And that meant that honestly, and I said probably a bit very openly, the levels of conversations like we were having were just completely open and sharing everything we had, because at the time there was a single focus, which was how do we find medicines that will work in COVID-19? And of course, we still don't know that yet.
Thank you. Chris, pardon me, we're expecting very soon a letter from Sir Simon Stevens, Chief Executive of NHS England, about phase 3 of the NHS's recovery from the peak of the pandemic. You have, and others have, expressed a desire to keep this approach of local permission, so the ability of local organisations and local leaders to get on with things and deal with them as they see fit. I wonder if you might expand a little bit on that, but with particular relation to how they might work with industry, and whether or not you get a sense that that approach, which does seem to be signalled to a certain degree by NHS England, is shared by other players in the sector, the other regulators, the Care Quality Commission, and some of the medical and technical regulators that have been mentioned by Hugo and Rav.
Well, if you look at that first phase, I think you do have to acknowledge that there was a particular context, which effectively was we were about to be hit by our share of the global pandemic. We needed to move with incredible speed. There was a real focus on a single objective, and in a sense, the only way the NHS was going to be able to kind of meet that was to be really clear about what the objective was. And there was no kind of, in a sense, it was dead easy in the sense, because it was just basically avoid overwhelm and then effectively let people get on with it. I think I would make the observation that I think the next phase is much, much more complicated because of the existence of multiple objectives. So you're clearly going to have to carry on treating a set of COVID patients. We're going to have to keep surge capacity aside in case there is a second spike. You've then got to restart critical services. You've then got to start going through and trying to reduce the backlogs of demand that have built up. So we've already talked about the waiting lists. I think one of the real complications, and by the way, the other thing one of the things you're going to absolutely have to do also is effectively get significantly improve infection control, because it's very clear that at the moment one of the places where COVID is circulating the most is in healthcare settings. I think one of the problems we've got is it's really not clear at this point about exactly what the priorities are. So for us, I think what would be really helpful in phase 3 is to be very specific about what of those priorities, where we should be concentrating, and that, it seems to us, is national leaders' jobs. But then it's to really say, okay, let's set these objectives, here's the priority between them, then let you get on with it. I think there's a nervousness that some of the work that is emerging from the phase 3 is getting into huge amounts of kind of detail from the centre. And I think there's also a nervousness that, again, for perfectly understandable reasons, the centre will want to control what is going on. So, and again, talk about not going back. I think our chief executives are very clear that they want to keep that degree of local power to get on with things. In terms of the regulatory structure, it seems to me there is an interesting issue here, which is philosophically, it feels to me, we had built a very complex and fairly overbearing regulatory structure with obviously kind of patient safety absolutely at its heart. But in the face of that overwhelming objective, I think we were moving an awful lot quicker. The question is, as sort of of life settles down, actually, how far are we going to go back? I don't think we're going to stay right over here in terms of, you know, the need to really, really set aside quite a lot of stuff in the face of an overwhelming objective. But what I think people are really nervous about is we're not going to go right the way back over here to where we were before. So the question really is, how does that regime, how can we try and capture some of the spirit of that, what happened in the first phase, recognizing that, you know, we don't want to go right the way back over here. And just to reinforce the point really, that there is just that opportunity, exactly as you're saying, of keeping some of that real fleetedness of foot, but also the quality of the relationships that have been built up with commercial partners. And I thought Hugo's point was absolutely spot on, which is moving towards partnerships of value rather than just simple transactional purchase of existing products.
Rav, I think you wanted to jump in.
Yes, I mean, one of the questions I was going to ask Chris was, we're seeing data sets from other countries now, not being too much of a fan zone, but I heard you talking about Germany and the fact that they're putting aside sort of 25% of their capacity, and they're having to wait, and because obviously hospitals are cordoned off into different zones, that's going to have a huge impact, because that would mean, and obviously one of my passions, and obviously Hugo will do this, is how we do research and trials. But if we've got 25% of capacity that clearly has to be ready for a second peak, those areas are in hospitals, which often are areas where you would be bringing patients into who may well be getting oncology treatments or other areas. One of the areas that I'm trying to work out how we can partner with chief execs and other areas is, how do you create different areas and maybe even different hospitals? If, for example, you've got Imperial and you've got Hammersmith, Mary's, Charing Cross, how do you look at certain hospitals that may do certain things because obviously of the risk of infection spread?
Yeah, and my kind of sense is, I mean, it was really interesting the other day. I was speaking to one of the very, very experienced regional directors who really has been round the block. And I said, how's life? And they said back to me, the phrase they used was, trying to work out what to do in this next stage, and here's the key phrase, is the single most complicated and difficult thing I have done in my career. Just in terms of, because there are, and the phrase went on, because there are so many unknowns, many of which are not beyond, you know, many of which are not within your control. So I do think there is a really difficult task here. And if I'm honest, one of the things I'm worried about is that you can already feel the mounting pressure from patients, politicians, single condition charities, you know, Parliament, the media, saying, come on, NHS, you know, flick that switch, get back to where you were before, start getting through all of this backlog, start treating patients, get those critical services up and running. And the reality is, when you talk to chief executives, what they're saying is, hey, look, I'm going to be 20 to 25, 30, even some were saying 35, 40% of capacity down. I've not got the PPE and the testing available to do at the moment that I kind of need. I've got a bunch of very tired staff. And then when you ask the question, well, how long before you think you can get to really, really running at the kind of pace you were before, recognizing it's a new normal pace as opposed to old pace? And they're saying to us 9, 12, 15 months. So I do think there is a real issue here about how do we, and again, exactly, you put it very well, Rav, how do we work together in partnership to solve some of these problems? Like, for example, if you've got a diagnostic facility that's stuck, in a sense, right in the middle of a COVID hot zone, how can you create a diagnostic hub that actually, you know, you can free from some of those restrictions that you're inevitably going to have if you're trying to run both, you know, run it in the middle of a COVID zone?
Thanks. Hugo.
Well, just building upon on the comments of Chris and Rav. So one of the advantages we have now is that we are hit a bit later by the COVID-19 wave, so we can look at countries that are a little bit further. And it was now like mentioning Germany, but there are many others, Netherlands, Austria, Switzerland, and so on. And I think we have to take that opportunity to see what works well over there, and also where we could learn what you should not do. And the example of Germany has been given, but of course, a country like Germany, they had spare capacity before COVID-19. We in the NHS, we are in a different situation. So we have to be even better than these countries moving forward. Otherwise, we will end up with huge waiting lists, and the price to pay from this waiting list could be higher than the COVID-19 impact. So if patients don't get their cancer diagnosis, early treatment, and so on, we will suffer medically, but even financially from it, because the cost will be higher. I think in the question of national guidelines, local authority to move on, for me, it's a combination of both. I think, yes, we could benefit from clearer national guidelines, pre-post surgical isolation before treatment, track and tracing, PPE, sometimes we're still too complex, not efficient enough, infection prevention. From the other hand, I think it's also a learning that it's important to give that, what Chris was mentioning, I think like this, a local level authority to be agile, and the situation will be very different from one trust to another. So it's also important that we not slow ourselves nationwide down by the slowest mover.
Let me ask a question, particularly to Hugo and Rav, about how the pharmaceutical sector and the medical devices sector internationally has recognised. We've talked about how the NHS has changed, how healthcare regulators have changed. I'm interested to know how much the corporate culture within the big international pharmaceutical and medical devices companies, both of which you work for, has changed. Has there been a recognition at the very top of your organisations that just as healthcare organisations and systems and regulators have to change, that companies need to change in the way in which they go about their work? And if so, how? So what is that sort of change that you want to see from the healthcare sector and those involved in it? Is that also reflected in your own corporate cultures? Rav, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, and it's interesting because I was talking to this exactly the same piece to, again, the MHRA and NIHR and other stakeholders, because our borders are somewhat different. So Hugo, one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world, one of the biggest devices companies in the world, and Roche, the same. So I'd say there were a couple of learns that we had as we went through this. The first for me was pace. We're actually quite slow. Hate to, probably not giving away a secret here. Things for us take time, and Chris will obviously know it's quite difficult to deal with these big organisations. The first thing is we all singly align behind the fact that a lot of this was going to be research focused, because obviously there were no treatments for COVID-19. Now I'm not in the vaccines world, but obviously there were treatments for people who had COVID-19 and vaccines, but people quickly had to align, which meant that international companies could work across borders, which is why we knew what was happening in China. And then we used that information in other countries to talk to governments very, very quickly. And we shared that information. Now, I'm going to be a bit strange here, but Nazim Taleb, who talked around the Black Swan, has talked around how what we can have at the moment is a move to nationalism and localism. Now, we've got to be really careful with that, because COVID-19, that one disease is affecting a patient in China and a patient in San Francisco. But so the treatments we create and the vaccines will have to be global. So the second learn I would have is that those boundaries, even for us, where, to be honest, I probably didn't spend much time talking to my international colleagues, so our healthcare systems were different, they disappeared. Because suddenly I'm on a phone call with, I can remember this vividly, talking to the Italian medical director at Roche. It's a heartbreaking story. And we were not quite in the early stages of the pandemic. And I rang up and I said, how can we help? We're hearing signals about the use of a particular drug. And she went, yeah, it's been a pretty difficult day because I've lost two of my colleagues. It was two friends, actually, two of her friends, not Roche colleagues, but two of her friends. And then we realized that this is a new world. So we all had to collaborate incredibly quickly and move quickly to do this. And what was also interesting is the boundaries quickly between pharmaceutical companies dropped. So I know that's I know that's a bit different for your audience with chief execs and finance directors, but often you'll know that we don't often talk to each other very much because of competition law. But what happened was those catalysts brought us together. So NIHR brought groups together so that we would problem solve together. That I hope will be maintained in the future, because otherwise we'll just revert back and we'll lose that sort of working with purpose. But Hugo, intrigued what you think about how we've all worked together.
Well, the same. I think the whole outbreak of COVID-19 provoked like introspection for the industry. And so, to your point, Rav, what is our purpose? So, in the case of J&J, it's like we have a credo. So, what's on our credo? So, and then there are things like, hey, we want to use our scale, our capabilities for the good, to change trajectory of health for humanity. And if it's that, well, then it's now, and then we have to act now. And typically big organizations, maybe like the NHS, but certainly also like, I think, Roche and J&J, are complex and slow. So how can we act for the good? And often it means like, setting the risk analysis aside and just act. And the examples are legion. So the vaccines development, which the different companies often are doing now at full risk. Typically, it would take 5 to 10 years. Now we started doing production, I think already like in February. And so before starting the clinical tests, certainly in humans. Same for treatments, same for all the delivery of PPE material. So in many domains, we would have internal complex decision making, which also would make us slow. Now it's just like, what is our purpose? How can we contribute? How can we be of value for society, and just act?
Chris, I want to start with you, Chris. I want to spend the last sort of 15 minutes or so exploring what the opportunities are, because we've talked a lot about how things have changed, and we've talked a lot about what the barriers remain, and the scale and the complexity of the challenge that's ahead of us. So let's just try and spend this last sort of 10, 15 minutes focusing on the sort of the practical, the opportunities. And Chris, starting with you, what opportunities do you think there do remain in the area of industry and NHS collaboration to fix the various problems, whether it be new service models, whether it be particular challenges like new cohort of COVID patients? We know that those recovering from COVID take a long time to recover, or whether it be things like the 10 million waiting list, if that was the case. What are the opportunities, and how are they best realised? Chris, starting with you.
Well, the phrase that comes to mind is target-rich environment. I mean, there's going to basically be a whole load of different things where effectively I think, it feels to me like the challenge for the NHS feels like it's grown exponentially in terms of, we were already, let's be honest about it, kind of struggling to match supply and demand, and we were already having difficulty in terms of waiting list performance. It's a very crude measure, isn't it? But if you just take those measures, both A&E waiting times, but also elective waiting times, actually we were probably heading for some of the worst performance we've had in a decade. And yet now what we've had layered on top is effectively a really difficult virus and disease to deal with, and then a significant reduction in capacity. So wherever you look, I think there are going to be opportunities. If I pick out 3 or 4, I think Hugo's already mentioned the digital opportunity. I think it's very clear that you can make significant leaps forward if we can carry on, the speed of development, innovation, digital innovation that we've had. Secondly, I can't really see how we can do what we need to do without thinking very differently about how we deliver certain services. I mean, we've talked about, for example, already talked about creating diagnostic hubs. What you can also see is potentially is a very different relationship between, we haven't really talked about it so far, but different relationship between the independent provision sector. So, you know, the Ramses, the Spires, the BMIs, etc. You can absolutely see it's vital that that capacity is fully and effectively utilised. The elective waiting lists, you know, how we're going to get through those at pace. But wherever you look, there are opportunities. I mean, I was talking to an ophthalmologist the other day who was talking about some fantastic things they'd started to kind of pioneer in terms of working with a commercial supplier to do some very interesting stuff on AI and machine learning in terms of ophthalmology diagnosis. And wherever you look, I think there are opportunities. The issue really is working out how we can get those developed at pace and then also rolled out at scale.
So what is it that you're looking for from industry to help you achieve that pace and scale?
Well, I thought I still keep coming back to Hugo's phrase about building partnerships of value, and I'd be really interested to hear what Rav and Hugo say. But the kind of conversations I have with the Hugos and the Ravs of the world always goes around. We seem to be able to make this kind of innovative partnership work in 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 different places, but trying to make it work across, for example, all 141 acute hospitals. Talk about pushing water uphill. It's really, really difficult. And I think, you know, there's again a very difficult issue here, isn't there, about each one of the 141 will quite rightly say, look, you know, different circumstances, local leadership. But I think the real question is, how do we get the real closeness of relationship, of innovation between, you know, doing something brand new, but then crucially get it picked up at speed across the system as a whole, but not doing that in a way in which you've got NHS England and Improvement saying thou shalt across 100, you know, a whole bunch of different different innovations. Those seems to me only work if they feel like they're owned here. So that, I think, for me has been the conundrum ever since I've been in the NHS about how, you know, you seem to be able to find individual examples of the kind of partnership and the kind of innovation that you're looking for, but you can never get them picked up at scale consistently across the whole piece.
Yeah, well, I think the point you make about when it does happen, people then tend to complain about it being imposed on them.
Yes,
and
exactly.
You can see that exactly with the use of the Attend Anywhere software, which has swept across the NHS and has, you know, really helped increase the amount of virtual consultation that has gone on in the NHS. But then a number of people within the service are concerned that they didn't get any choice in the matter, that they were told to use this software. So let's start with Rav. What do you see the opportunities? How do you think the sector can respond to the kind of challenges that Chris went? What is the contribution that you've still got in your locker, so to speak, that you think you can now bring forward? Rav, beginning with you.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think there's sort of 3 key areas for me. I think the first is there's certain things that we have expertise at. And I think the first part of this, and it crosses all of the NHS trusts, is helping everything get back to a steady state as much as we can, knowing the fact that we'll have to clearly look at getting ready for a second wave. I'll give you 2 examples here. 2 major cancer hospitals that we partner with are clearly behind in things like their work they're doing now with data entry for trials. We have to partner on that because they're a month or so behind. And that's something we can help with, and those shared partnerships. But shared partnerships that deliver value, I think, get back to the status quo as much as we can. The second part is, you mentioned it already, we know that obviously these patients are being discharged, and specifically COVID-19. How do we build those links with social care? Because we know they're going back into the community, etc. There's some work being done about following up with these patients in the NHS. How can that be done with shared value? And this will come into Hugo's world around digital, but also following these patients up. We've had, unfortunately, hundreds of thousands of patients that have had who've been trauma to their lungs. So I don't know, Chris Brightling's team.
Sorry to interrupt, Rav. I mean, that's very interesting. Explain to me the role the pharmaceutical sector, in your case, could play in helping support the NHS deal with this new cohort of COVID recovering patients.
And this is a really good question, because everyone often thinks of this is where we came back to trust at the beginning. People often see a transactional relationship related to a drug or related to a device. And actually what we're becoming are data companies and companies that can partner and look at shared value. We've got infrastructure that can help the follow-up of these patients. Now, that will then mean that a clinician, a healthcare professional, a finance director, or chief exec can then look at their data and then make choices. Now, those are things that we have at scale. Now, if we can partner on that, and I'll give you probably an example where the NHS has done this brilliantly over this, and it's world leading. So there is, and it's a trial that was created at Oxford. So the recovery trial, which is a trial from academia, has over 170 centres and over 11,000 patients in it. What I would like to see is, how can you use these systems that have been set up now and move them to the future? Because if you just leave them as isolated hubs in time, we're not going to learn from what's happened. And that therefore means that those can be done in partnerships with multiple companies. And I'm not just talking about the pharmaceutical sector as well. There could be multiple different areas of partnerships as we go forward. So I think for me, it's truly understanding and building, coming back right to the beginning, having those open conversations with that single purpose in mind. And if we can do that, we can build on some of the platforms that the UK has been world leading on over this incredibly difficult time through the pandemic.
Thank you, Hugo. We're nearly out of time, so I am going to give you the honour of the last word.
Thank you very much. So I think your original question was like, hey, with now better collaboration, industry, NHS, what else should we do looking forward? And then I would speak out maybe to zoom out. And for me, it would be work together on broader population health. I once heard Lord Pryor say, well, with our smoking rates and obesity rates in the UK, we'll never score well on cancer rates. And here again with COVID-19, you saw that, yeah, if you have a vulnerable population with obesity, smoking, and big BAME communities, for instance, you're hit harder. So I believe if we work also together more like on the broader population health topics of obesity and smoking, so prevention, but not only prevention, also early diagnosis, early treatment, then we're really gonna help, the whole health situation in the UK and be better prepared for all the challenges ahead of the NHS.
Thank you, Hugo. That's a very good point on which to end. So Hugo, Chris, Rav, thank you very much for your contributions. And thank you all who are watching this for watching it. I hope you found it useful. Please give us feedback. If you have, then it's a subject we will surely return to. Thanks very much. Cheerio.
Thank you.